You wake to the sound of steel. Not the clash of it in a tourney, nor the proud, ringing draw of a royal guard's sword. This is a different sound entirely. A sound that belongs to the shadows and the creeping things of the world. It is the sound of a blade being sharpened in the pre-dawn darkness of the Tower of London, May 19th, 1536, a Friday. The rhythmic shh of wet stone against metal is a death knell, a serpent's hiss in the damp morning air. Each stroke cuts through the river mist coiling outside your window, deliberate, methodical, final. A sound that promises an ending. You are Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, and in less than 4 hours, that very blade will separate your head from your shoulders. The cold stone walls of your cell, the grand apartments you occupied before your coronation, seem to pulse with the frantic rhythm of your own heart. A cruel jest of Henry's to house you here, to surround you with the ghosts of triumph while you await the finality of disgrace. You sit on the edge of the narrow bed, the fine linens a mockery of comfort. Your hands, resting in your lap, tremble. It is not the morning chill that seizes you, but the crushing weight of knowing. Outside the barred window, another sound joins the grisly chorus. The rhythmic thump of hammers. Carpenters. They are building the stage for your final performance. Each blow of their mallets is a physical impact, echoing through the marrow of your bones. A countdown to oblivion that began weeks ago when the first whisper of the king's displeasure turned into a roar of accusation. Your ladies-in-waiting, the few who have not abandoned you, move about the chamber like specters, their faces pale and drawn with a grief they dare not speak aloud. They are phantoms in a world that has already begun to forget you. They dress you as if for a somber court appearance, their touch both tender and terrified. A gown of gray damask, dark as a storm cloud, with a red kirtle beneath. You had initially requested black, the color of profound mourning, but the message from the king's man was firm. Gray, not black. A subtle distinction, but a meaningful one. Black was for a queen, gray was for a penitent. Even in death, Henry seeks to control the narrative. The white chemise they slip over your head feels like a shroud, its purity a bitter irony. Mourning and purity. You wonder which, in the eyes of God and your husband, applies to you now. The air in the tower is a thick brew of river mud, ancient stone, and human misery. But this morning it is tinged with something else. The cloying sweetness of incense from the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where prayers are being said for your condemned soul, and beneath it, the faint, metallic tang of fear. It is your own. You can hear the murmur of voices beyond your door, the shuffle of feet on stone, the distant clink of armor as the guard is changed. The great grinding machinery of the state, of Henry's will, is already in motion, and you, Anne, who once believed you were the operator, are merely the central gilded piece in this elaborate, choreographed horror. You are the grain, to be crushed by the millstone. The nightmare that would end here in this cold gray dawn began not with treason or the breathless accusations of adultery, but with a silence, the silence of a womb that would not hold a son. It began with Henry's desperate, all-consuming need for a male heir, and his growing, simmering obsession with the pale, placid face of Jane Seymour. By January of this year, the world still seemed yours to command. You were pregnant again, the hope of a prince a flickering candle against the encroaching darkness of the court's disapproval. Then came the joust. Henry, ever the peacock, ever needing to prove his virility and strength, had taken a brutal fall. Unconscious for 2 hours, the court held its breath. As the king lay near death, a dreadful premonition seized you. It was a prophecy written in blood and terror. That same day, the life within you gave way. A torrent of pain and blood, and with it the last of your hopes. the symbolism was lost on no one. As the king's life had wavered, so too had your precarious hold on the crown. The miscarried child, the midwives whispered with averted eyes, was a boy, a prince, perfect in his miniature form, but lifeless. The news, when it reached Henry, was not received with solace or shared grief. It was received as a verdict. Henry, who had torn England from the grasp of Rome, who had defied the Pope and a Holy Roman Emperor to make Your his wife, began to speak in hushed, furious tones. He whispered it to his counselors, to the shadows in the corridors of Whitehall. Their union, he claimed, the very one he had proclaimed as God's true will, was cursed, bewitched. He had been seduced into it by sorcery. The same theological contortions he had used to annul your marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the same righteous fury, were now being honed into a weapon to be used against you. The irony was so exquisite in its cruelty, it could have been forged in hell. The very justifications that had raised you to the throne would now be used to build your scaffold. But divine displeasure was not enough. To cast you aside like Catherine would be to admit his own folly, to call into question his own sacred judgment, and most critically, to endanger the legitimacy of your daughter, Elizabeth. He needed legal grounds. He needed a monster. The first thread he pulled was a musician, Mark Smeaton. Young, handsome, with an easy, liquid charm and dark eyes that lingered a moment too long on the court ladies. He was everything Henry was not. Lithe, graceful, his hands creating beauty on the virginals rather than gripping the reins of a warhorse. On the 30th of April, as the court buzzed with preparations for the May Day revels, Cromwell's men came for Smeaton. They did not take him to the Tower, not yet. They took him to Cromwell's own house in Stepney, a place where the king's law was secondary to the minister's will. What happened within those walls was never officially recorded, for the tools of persuasion Cromwell favored were best left to the imagination. We can picture it, though. The creeping dread in the musician's eyes as the questions began, his initial protestations of innocence, his confident denials of any impropriety with the Queen. Then the shift, the quiet threat, the sight of the rack, the slow, methodical application of pain. We can imagine a man, broken by a terror so profound it dissolved his very being, willing to say anything, to confess to any sin, to name any name, just to make the agony stop. When Mark Smeaton emerged from Cromwell's house, he was a ghost of his former self, ready to confess not just to a fleeting moment of adultery with you, but to specific dates, times, and places. He provided the backbone for the beast Cromwell was creating. With Smeaton's confession, a cracked and broken cornerstone, Cromwell moved with breathtaking speed. The trap was sprung. During the May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace, a festival of spring and renewal, the web tightened. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool, one of his oldest and closest friends, was arrested. The irony was a deliberate poisoned dart, turning a day of joy into a spectacle of fear. Norris had been Henry's confidant for over a decade, a man who had shared the king's most private moments, who had helped him dress and undress, who knew the king's moods better than anyone. His alleged crime was not just a betrayal of his marriage vows, but a treason of the deepest dye, the betrayal of the man who had raised him from minor nobility to a position of staggering power. Under interrogation, even in the face of Cromwell's chilling gaze, Norris maintained his innocence. His steadfastness was either the product of a clear conscience or the grim awareness that any confession, true or false, led directly to the block. William Brereton followed Norris to the Tower on May 4th. A gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, his Welsh origins and reliance on royal favor made him a more pliable target. To the charge of adultery, Cromwell added another, more sinister layer: conspiracy to murder the king. Suddenly, this was not merely about lust, it was about a plot to seize the throne itself, with you, the queen, planning to marry one of your lovers and rule as a puppet master. The narrative was growing darker, more monstrous. Then came Sir Francis Weston, arrested on the 5th of May. Barely 25, handsome, wealthy, and newly married, his inclusion baffled court observers. He had no need to curry your favor, no reason to risk his golden future for a dangerous affair. His youth, his charm, his sheer love of life made his alleged participation seem preposterous. But his inclusion served a purpose. It suggested that your depravity was so magnetic, so irresistible, that it could corrupt even the most fortunate of men. It was the final arrest, however, that sent a shockwave of genuine horror through the venal, jaded heart of the court. It was the one that revealed the true, bottomless depth of Henry's cruelty, a cruelty that went beyond political necessity and into the realm of the purely personal and sadistic. On May 2nd, your own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was arrested. The charge was so monstrous, so utterly beyond the pale, that it silenced all whispers, all debate. Incest. The word itself was a venomous stain. It transformed you from a mere adulteress into a creature of unnatural lusts, a demon in human form, so depraved that no punishment could be too severe. George was your other half, as intelligent, as cultured, as quick-witted as you were. His sharp tongue had won him as many enemies as friends, but his loyalty to you had been absolute. Henry, in his spiraling paranoia, saw that loyalty not as familial devotion, but as a threat to his own authority. By charging George with incest, Cromwell was not just destroying your brother, he was isolating you completely. He was ensuring that no one, not even your own blood, would dare speak in your defense, lest they be tainted by association with such an abhorrent crime. The arrests occurred within 5 days. It was not an investigation. It was a demolition, a precisely timed, ruthlessly executed purge designed to give your allies no time to rally, no time to think, no time to even comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen the House of Boleyn. You yourself were arrested on May 2nd. The timing was, as always, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. You had just returned from watching a tennis match at Greenwich, where you had seen Henry playing with Francis Weston. Your last moments of freedom were spent watching your husband enjoying a game with the very man who, within 3 days, would be officially named as your lover and a traitor. The charges were read to you by your own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who owed his station in part to your family's meteoric rise, now stood before you, his face a mask of grim duty, and pronounced your doom. His participation was the ultimate lesson in Tudor politics. Family, loyalty, love, all were chaff to be scattered by the winds of royal favor and personal survival. Your reaction, as recorded by the ever-watchful eyes of the court, was one of stunned disbelief. When the accusations of adultery were first read, you laughed. Not a laugh of mirth, but a sharp, hysterical bark of absurdity. The idea that you, the Queen of England, whose every waking moment was observed, whose every word was recorded, could have conducted not one, but 5 simultaneous affairs was so preposterous, so logically impossible, that laughter was the only sane response. But as the list of horrors continued, adultery with 5 men, incest with your own brother,
conspiracy to murder the king, plotting to marry another after his death, the laughter died in your throat, choked by a rising tide of ice. This was not about finding truth. This was about creating a narrative of such comprehensive treason that it touched every aspect of your life, poisoning your past, obliterating your present, and damning your future. The journey by barge from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London took you along the same stretch of the Thames where, just 3 years earlier, a flotilla of gilded boats had escorted you to your coronation. Then, the banks had been thronged with cheering crowds, the air thick with the scent of flowers and celebration. Now, they watched in a sullen, fearful silence as the fallen queen passed by, a prisoner surrounded by impassive guards. The contrast was a physical agony, a journey through the landscape of your own memory, from the pinnacle of ambition to the abyss of despair. Few who entered the tower through the Traitor's Gate ever emerged alive. Upon your arrival, Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, a man whose features seemed carved from granite, escorted you to your lodgings. And here was the final, exquisite turn of the screw. You were housed in the very same royal apartments you had occupied in the joyous days before your coronation. The same tapestries depicting heroic hunts and chivalric romances now seemed to mock you from the walls. The same heavy oak furniture that had witnessed your greatest moment of glory would now bear witness to your utter degradation. It was a prison designed by a poet of cruelty. Kingston was under strict orders to record your every word, your every sigh, your every moment of weakness. His meticulously detailed reports, sent daily to Cromwell, paint a portrait of a woman oscillating between defiance and despair. At times, you were the queen, imperious and indignant, proclaiming your innocence with a regal dignity that unnerved your jailers. At others, you collapsed under the sheer, crushing weight of your fate, weeping for your daughter, for your brother.
Yet, through it all, one thing remained constant, a fragile thread of hope that, in hindsight, seems almost tragically naive. You could not, would not believe that Henry would actually have you executed. "The king has been good to me," you would tell your weeping ladies, a strange, feverish confidence in your eyes. "He has raised me from a private gentlewoman to a marchioness, from a marchioness to a queen. And now, as he has no further advancement to give me on earth, he will send me to heaven." You expressed, again and again, your faith in his mercy, in the shared history and the passionate love that had once bound you together. This unwavering faith in Henry's essential humanity reveals either a fundamental misunderstanding of the man you had married or a psychological inability to accept the monstrous reality of your situation. You were trapped not only by the tower's walls, but by the prison of your own past love. The trial of your alleged co-conspirators began on May 12th in the cavernous expanse of Westminster Hall. It was a masterclass in judicial theater, a performance designed not to uncover guilt or innocence, but to provide a veneer of legal legitimacy to what was, in essence, a series of political assassinations. The evidence presented was a flimsy patchwork of gossip, innuendo, and circumstantial connections. A gift you had given to Norris, a private conversation overheard between you and Weston, Smeaton's presence at a court event. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of whispers, cemented by the confession extracted from the terrified musician. Even Smeaton's confession was problematic. The idea that a court musician of modest birth would risk the hideous death of a traitor for an affair with the Queen stretched the bounds of credulity. Yet his words, born of pain and terror, were the cornerstone upon which the entire conspiracy rested. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston stood firm. They maintained their innocence with a courage that was either born of truth or a defiant acceptance of their fate. They refused to confess even when Cromwell's agents dangled the possibility of commuted sentences, of a quick death by the axe rather than the gruesome ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. They were men with everything to live for: wealth, status, families, and nothing to gain by protecting a queen who was so clearly doomed. Their silence in the face of death speaks more loudly than Smeaton's tortured confession. The trial of your brother George, held separately due to his noble rank, was the most dramatic. Possessing a brilliant legal mind and the same sharp eloquence as you, he chose to defend himself. His performance in Westminster Hall was, by all accounts, electrifying. He dismantled the prosecution's arguments with cold logic and passionate rhetoric, his voice ringing with conviction. Observers noted that the jury seemed swayed, their faces etched with uncertainty. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed that one pillar of Cromwell's monstrous edifice might crumble. A single acquittal could bring the whole thing down. But then, George made a fatal error. It was an act born not of foolishness, but of a desperate, furious desire to clear your name and expose the hypocrisy at the heart of the proceedings. The prosecution presented him with a piece of paper, a written question he was instructed to read silently and then answer. But George, his eyes blazing with a reckless fire, read it out loud for the entire court to hear. The question concerned the king's virility. It contained your alleged complaints, whispered in confidence to your brother, that Henry was impotent, unable to satisfy you as a husband. A collective gasp sucked the air from the great hall. To question the king's manhood, his physical potency, was to question his fitness to rule. It was an insult so profound, a truth so dangerous, that it instantly sealed George's fate. It no longer mattered if he was innocent of incest. He was guilty of lèse-majesté of the highest order. In his effort to defend your honor, he had committed suicide. The verdicts were, of course, a foregone conclusion. Guilty. All of them. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George, by virtue of his nobility, was sentenced to the cleaner death of beheading. Henry, in a gesture of what was proclaimed as magnanimity, commuted the sentences of the 4 commoners to beheading as well. It was a calculated mercy, designed to prevent the gruesome public spectacle that might have generated sympathy for the condemned men. He wanted them dead, but he did not want them to become martyrs. On the clear, bright morning of May 17th, 5 men died on Tower Hill for their alleged love of you. Mark Smeaton, the musician who had begun it all, went to his death still maintaining his guilt. Was it genuine remorse? A final, desperate attempt to protect others? Or was his mind so broken by torture that he no longer knew what was true? We will never know. Norris, Brereton, and Weston all proclaimed their innocence to the last, their final words carefully recorded by the chroniclers who understood the historical weight of the moment. George's execution was the most poignant. As he stood upon the scaffold, his face pale but composed, he represented the final destruction of your family, the fall of the house that had risen so high and so fast. His final speech was a model of dignity and eloquence, a protestation of his innocence delivered with the wit and grace that had once made him a star of Henry's court. Confined to your apartments, you would have heard it all: the murmur of the gathering crowd, the tolling of the bell, the sudden, terrible silence, and then the sharp, wet thud of the executioner's axe, 5 times. The psychological torture was immense. To know that men, friends, your own beloved brother had died because of you their names forever linked with yours in a fiction of treason and depravity, must have been an agony beyond bearing. Meanwhile, Henry had already moved on, with a speed that was nothing short of breathtaking in its callousness. Even before your own trial had begun, he was finalizing the arrangements for his marriage to Jane Seymour. Where you had been dark, fiery, and intellectually challenging, Jane was fair, submissive, and placid. She was a quiet harbor after the tempest of your marriage to you. He was already building his future on the rubble of your life. Your own trial was set for May 15th, held within the Great Hall of the Tower itself. The location was a strategic choice, avoiding any possibility of public demonstrations in your favor, ensuring the proceedings took place under the intimidating shadow of your prison. You entered the hall wearing a gown of dark gray damask, your face a mask of regal composure. You were escorted by your ladies, their presence a strange comfort and a constant reminder that you were still being watched. And presiding over it all as Lord High Steward was your uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The sight of him, his face set like stone, pronouncing judgment on his own niece, was the most vivid illustration imaginable of the brutal calculus of power. In the world Henry had created, blood was thinner than water, and survival was the only true allegiance. The clerk's voice droned on, reading the litany of charges. Adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536. The specificity of the dates and locations was meant to lend an air of irrefutable fact to the fantasy. Yet it was this very precision that betrayed the fabrication. Court records, had anyone dared to consult them, would have shown you were either heavily pregnant or recovering from childbirth during many of the alleged trysts, making the physical demands of such rampant promiscuity a near impossibility. The charge of incest with George was dated to November 2nd, 1535. The timing was significant, placing the alleged crime well after your last pregnancy had ended, suggesting not a crime of passion, but a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy. It was all part of Cromwell's narrative, a queen so depraved, so hungry for power, that no sin was beneath her. When given the opportunity to speak, you denied everything. Your voice did not tremble. You answered each charge with a clarity and firmness that impressed even your enemies. But your defense was a hopeless gesture. In this court, you had no rights. You could not call witnesses. You could not cross-examine your accusers. You were not permitted legal counsel. It was not a trial. It was a ritual of condemnation. The evidence consisted of testimony from servants and courtiers, a tapestry woven from jealousy, fear, and ambition, a suspicious glance, a private conversation, a gift exchanged. One particularly damning piece of testimony came from a Lady Wingfield, who was, conveniently, already dead. Before her passing, she had allegedly confided in others that she knew of your misconduct. The testimony of a ghost, unable to be challenged, was accepted as fact. The proceedings took a single day. The 26 peers who sat as your jury, men who owed their titles, their lands, their very lives to Henry's favor, retired to consider their verdict. There was no suspense. Among them were men who had once been your staunchest supporters, who had championed your cause and celebrated your rise. Now they sat with bowed heads, ready to condemn you to save themselves. The guilty verdict was announced by your uncle, Norfolk, his voice thick with what some observers described as emotion. Was it sorrow or relief at having completed his grim, soul-staining duty? He pronounced the sentence, death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. The option of burning was a nod to the ancient punishment for female traitors, a final, terrifying threat. You received the news with that same unnerving composure. You raised your head, and your voice, clear and steady, rang through the hall. O Father, O Creator, Thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, thou knowest that I have not deserved this death." Then turning your gaze back to your earthly judges, you concluded, "And I will ask for no mercy from the king, for I am sure that if he had shown me any, he would have done so already." In the days that followed, the days between condemnation and execution, your carefully constructed composure began to fray. In the privacy of your chambers, attended by your ladies and watched by Kingston, the full horror of your situation descended. You swung violently between a feverish hope that Henry would relent and a black, bottomless despair. You would laugh one moment, a brittle, high-pitched sound, remarking on the smallness of your neck and assuring your ladies the executioner would have little trouble. The next, you would be found weeping, clutching a prayer book, your body racked with sobs. The question of your guilt has echoed down the centuries. Was it possible? The evidence, scrutinized by generations of historians, remains laughably thin. The confession was extracted by torture. The dates were impossible. The logistics of carrying on multiple affairs under the constant, unblinking eye of the court were fantastical. And none of the men, save the broken Smeaton, confessed. They chose a hideous death over a lie. The political context is far more convincing. By 1536, you had failed in your primary duty, to provide a male heir. Henry, his passion for you long since cooled into resentment, was already infatuated with Jane Seymour. You were no longer an asset, you were an obstacle. And Henry VIII was a man who cleared obstacles from his path with ruthless finality. Perhaps you were not entirely blameless. Your wit could be sharp, your tongue cutting. You had been arrogant, dismissive of your enemies, and your treatment of Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary had won you no friends. Your intelligence and political acumen, qualities that had once captivated Henry, had become threatening to a king whose ego was as vast as it was fragile. You were not a passive queen. You argued with him, challenged him, and that, perhaps, was your greatest crime. As you awaited your death, the final legal maneuvers were being put into place. On May 14th, the day before your trial, Archbishop Cranmer, a man you had once counted as a friend and ally, was summoned to declare your marriage to Henry null and void. The grounds? Henry's previous affair with your sister, Mary. The irony was a gaping, bleeding wound. Henry was simultaneously executing you for committing adultery within your marriage, while legally declaring that no valid marriage had ever existed. The contradiction mattered less than the convenience. By annulling the marriage, Henry rendered your daughter, Elizabeth, illegitimate. He was not just killing you, he was erasing you. You had never been queen, your daughter was a bastard. Your life's work, the reformation you had championed, the power you had wielded, all of it was being reduced to a sordid dalliance of a deluded king with a conniving witch. The final insult, dressed as a mercy, was the executioner. Henry, in a gesture of refined cruelty, decided against the common English axe. He was importing a master swordsman from Calais. The French method was known to be quicker, cleaner, more certain. The choice served multiple purposes. It presented your death as a sophisticated, almost continental affair, rather than a brutish English butchering. It distanced Henry from the act, and it eliminated the risk of a sympathetic English executioner botching the job. The sword itself became an object of dread and fascination in your final days. It was kept hidden, adding to the psychological tension, a sleek foreign blade waiting to complete the work the English court had begun. The morning of May 19th dawned gray and misty. You woke early, having barely slept. You dressed with meticulous care. The dark gray damask gown, the red kirtle, the white linen chemise. Your famous dark hair, which had once captivated a king, was tucked neatly into a white coif. Practicality now governed even these final, intimate acts. As you ate a morsel of bread and drank a little wine, you could hear the crowd gathering on the Tower Green. A queen's execution was an unprecedented spectacle. This was not some common traitor. This was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed the world. When Sir William Kingston arrived, his face grim, you stood to meet him. "I hear I shall not die before noon," you said, your voice steady. "I am very sorry, therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain." He bowed his head. "The pain, madam, shall be little. It is so subtle." And then you laughed, that same brittle, unnerving laugh. "I have heard say the executioner is very good," you said, encircling your throat with your delicate hands. "And I have a little neck." The walk from your apartments to the scaffold on Tower Green was the longest journey of your life. Every stone in the courtyard seemed to whisper your name. Every window held a face. Every shadow seemed to mock your former glory. As you emerged into the open, a hush fell over the thousands who had gathered. Here was the witch, the whore, the traitor, and yet here was a queen. The scaffold was a simple wooden platform raised only a few feet from the ground, draped in black. Upon it stood the executioner, a figure of terrifying anonymity in his black hood. His sword was hidden beneath a pile of straw. You mounted the steps, assisted by your weeping ladies. You turned to face the crowd, a sea of pale, upturned faces. This was your final performance, and you knew the script by heart. "Good Christian people," your voice rang out, clear and surprisingly strong. "I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." You spoke of the king, calling him a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. You did not proclaim your innocence. You did not attack Henry. To do so would have condemned your daughter. Your final words were a masterstroke of political calculation, a final act of maternal protection. "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." The lie must have tasted like ash in your mouth. You removed your ermine mantle, handing it to one of your ladies. They then tied a white blindfold over your eyes, their hands trembling so violently they could barely manage the knot. The world went dark. You knelt, your posture erect and dignified. You were a queen to the very last. You murmured a final prayer. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The executioner, seeing your ladies weeping uncontrollably, was distracted. "Move them away," he commanded Kingston, his French accent thick. As they were gently led away, he needed another distraction to ensure you would not flinch. "Boy, bring me my sword."
As the boy scurried to the straw, you would have instinctively turned your head toward the sound, and in that precise, calculated instant, the executioner, who had already retrieved his blade, stepped forward. The movement was a blur of liquid grace, a silver arc in the gray morning light. There was no sound but a soft, whistling sigh as the air parted. The blade, honed to a razor's edge, was so swift, so precise, that for a fraction of a second, your head remained perfectly balanced on your neck. Then it tumbled forward onto the straw. Your eyes, it was later whispered, were still open, and your lips were still moving, as if finishing their final prayer. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. Some fainted, others crossed themselves, whispering prayers for your soul. Your ladies, with a terrible, grief-stricken courage, moved forward. They gathered your remains, wrapping your head and body in a white linen cloth, their tears staining the fabric. Within hours, Henry, out hunting, was informed that the deed was done. He showed no emotion, simply declaring, "The deed is done. Uncouple the hounds and let us follow the sport." That night, he celebrated. You were buried without ceremony in an old elm chest that had once held bow staves. Interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, you were laid to rest alongside your brother and the other men condemned with you. No monument, no marker,
just an unmarked grave for the queen who lost her head. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. He tried to erase you, removing your Falcon badge, carving your initials from the walls of his palaces, but he could not erase the memory, he could not erase the story, and he could not erase your greatest legacy, your daughter, Elizabeth, the bastard who would one day inherit his throne and become one of England's greatest monarchs. As the sun set on that dreadful day, the Tower of London settled into an uneasy quiet. The scaffold was gone, the blood-soaked straw cleared away. But in the growing darkness, as the river lapped against the fortress walls, something lingered. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, but the haunting, indelible memory of a queen who dared to challenge a king, who reached for the sun and was burned by it. The sound of steel being sharpened that had announced your final day gave way to eternal silence, a silence pregnant with the weight of all that had been lost, all that had been destroyed, and all that was yet to come. In that silence, the true, chilling horror of what really happened to Anne Boleyn finally revealed itself. Not just the death of a woman, but the murder of a future.